Prepare 4 coffins. Blood dripped from the brim of his weathered hat, pooling in the unforgiving Arizona dust. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. A nameless drifter stood before a saloon in a lawless boomtown, his eyes locked on the 4 men who had just made the final fatal mistake of their miserable lives. They thought a young girl was an easy target. They thought they ruled this forsaken desert. They were dead wrong. Stick around to hear a gritty, real-life tale of bloody, brilliant vengeance that history tried to bury. Dust choked the air in Owyhee Creek, settling over the wooden boardwalks and hitching posts like a burial shroud. It was August of 1878, and the sun beat down with the malice of a scorned judge. Nothing thrived here except cheap liquor cholera and cruelty. Normal folks kept their heads down, their shutters closed, and their prayers silent. Out in the open, men with cold eyes and heavy holsters dictated the law. Cora, barely 13 years old, dragged a heavy wooden bucket from the communal well. Her dress, patched with flour sacks, clung to her thin frame soaked with sweat. She had lost her father to a mining accident in the Comstock lode 2 years prior, and her mother was currently coughing up blood in a squalid boarding house room upstairs. Survival meant fetching water, scrubbing floors, and trying to remain invisible. Visibility, however, was thrust upon her when a heavy boot kicked the bucket from her calloused hands. Water spilled into the dry, cracked earth, turning it to dark mud. Cora gasped, falling to her knees to frantically scoop the precious liquid back into the wooden pail, though it was a futile effort. Laughter, thick and wet with chewing tobacco, erupted above her. Cole Wallace stood there, thumbs hooked into his gun belt. He was a broad-shouldered brute with a jagged scar running from his left ear to his jawline, a souvenir from a knife fight in Abilene. Behind him stood his 3 shadows: Bo Miller, a twitchy former Confederate bushwhacker; Jackson Ford, a hulking man missing 2 front teeth; and Levi Stanton, a wiry rat of a man whose eyes constantly darted around the street. These 4 were the enforcers for the Wallace cattle outfit. They did not own Owyhee Creek on paper, but they owned it in lead and blood. No local badge dared cross them. The territorial sheriff had conveniently rode out to a neighboring county 3 days ago, leaving the town wide open for Cole's particular brand of entertainment. "Look what we have here, boys!" Cole sneered, kicking the empty bucket again, sending it clattering down the boardwalk. "A little mud hen playing in the dirt. You owe me for splashing my boots, girl." Cora kept her head down, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry, mister. I didn't mean no harm. Please, my mother needs this water." Bo Miller spat a stream of brown juice dangerously close to her fingers. "Your mother needs a pine box from what I hear. Maybe you need one too, little beggar." Cole reached down his thick, unwashed fingers, grabbing the back of Cora's frayed collar. He hoisted her up with a violent jerk, ignoring her terrified scream. He shook her like a rag doll. "I said you owe me. You think you can just disrespect the Wallace name in this town?" Down the street, shopkeepers peered through dirty glass windows. A woman sweeping her porch quickly hurried inside and bolted her door. No one moved to help. The silence of Owyhee Creek was a deafening endorsement of the brutality. Hooves crunched softly against the packed dirt at the edge of town. A solitary rider entered the main thoroughfare. His horse, a deep roan with a star on its forehead, moved with an exhausted, steady gait. The man in the saddle sat completely still, moving only with the rhythm of the animal. He wore a heavy canvas duster, coated in layers of alkali dust, and a flat-brimmed hat pulled low, obscuring his eyes. He had no badge. He had no name that he ever offered freely. To those who survived his acquaintance, he was a ghost made of leather and gun smoke. Stopping his roan near the livery stable, the drifter dismounted slowly. He did not immediately tie his horse to the post. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a handful of oats, and let the weary animal eat from his palm. His hands were scarred, the knuckles thick, the fingers long and steady. While he fed his horse, his head turned a fraction of an inch. Beneath the shadow of his brim, cold, analytical eyes surveyed the street. He saw the saloon doors swinging lazily in the hot wind. He saw the scared faces behind the mercantile glass, and he saw the 4 men cornering the weeping girl. Gunfighters, real ones, not the drunken braggarts who ended up dead in alleys, did not rush. They did math. The nameless man calculated distances. He noted the angle of the afternoon sun. It was behind him, meaning it would be in the eyes of the 4 thugs if they looked his way. He noticed Jackson Ford leaning heavily against a rain barrel, a burlap sack resting suspiciously over the top. A scattergun, he deduced. Ford was the immediate threat. He saw Bo Miller's hand resting nervously near the butt of his Remington. He saw the cowardice in Levi Stanton's posture, and he saw the arrogant, unearned confidence radiating from Cole Wallace. Across from the livery sat a small, dusty storefront. A faded wooden sign above the door read, Thaddeus Montgomery, Carpentry and Undertaking. Thaddeus, an older man with wire-rimmed glasses and a thick gray beard, sat in a rocking chair on his porch. He was vigorously whittling a piece of pine, his eyes fixed stubbornly on the block of wood, deliberately ignoring the girl's cries echoing 50 yards away. The drifter walked over his spurs, chiming a slow metallic death knell against the hard-packed earth. He stopped at the edge of Thaddeus's porch. Hot day for carving. The drifter said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that sounded like rocks grinding together. Thaddeus jumped, nearly dropping his knife. He hadn't heard the man approach. He looked at the stranger, taking in the worn grips of the Colt Peacemaker, sitting perfectly on the man's right hip. The holster was tied down tight to his thigh. This wasn't a farmer. Keeps the hands busy, Thaddeus muttered, glancing nervously down the street towards Cole Wallace, then back to his wood. Ain't much else to do in Owyhee Creek, sopped me. Seems there's plenty to do, the drifter noted, nodding slightly toward the commotion. Cole Wallace had just slapped Cora across the face, a sharp, sickening sound that cracked through the heavy air. The girl crumpled into the dirt, sobbing hysterically, clutching her bleeding cheek. Thaddeus winced, closing his eyes for a brief second. Look, stranger, I don't know who you are, and I don't want to know. But if you're thinking of growing a conscience, bury it. Those men ride for the Wallace Ranch. They got 40 guns out at their spread. You cross them, you don't just die, you die slow. The drifter pulled a small hand-rolled cheroot from his vest pocket. He struck a lucifer match against the porch railing, cupped the flame, and inhaled deeply. The acrid smoke drifted up to mingle with the dust. They look like they're having a fine time, the drifter observed, his tone devoid of any emotion. They're animals, Thaddeus whispered, fiercely leaning forward. But they are animals that own this territory. The sheriff ran out. The deputies are bought. That girl, it's a damn shame, but it's the way of the world here. You ride on, mister. Your horse looks like it needs water, and you look like you need to be anywhere but here. Down the street, Bo Miller grabbed Cora by the hair, hauling her back to her feet, while Cole Wallace laughed, preparing to strike her again. The drifter exhaled a long, thin stream of gray smoke. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly tired. He reached into his coat and tossed a heavy $20 double eagle gold coin onto the porch. It clattered and spun before landing flat at Thaddeus's boots. Thaddeus stared at the gold, then up at the stranger's shadowed face. What's this for? Prepare 4 coffins, the lone gunslinger said. He turned his back on the undertaker and stepped off the porch, his boots hitting the street. He didn't walk down the center of the street like a hero in a penny dreadful novel. He kept to the side, utilizing the shadows of the boardwalk awnings. His right hand swung naturally by his side, brushing within a fraction of an inch of his Colt's walnut grip with every step. Cole Wallace had his hand raised to strike Cora again when the sound of the approaching boots finally registered over his own booming laughter. He paused, turning his heavy head. The drifter stopped 30 feet away. The distance was deliberate, close enough for guaranteed accuracy, far enough to force the others to aim rather than just react. Let the girl go, the drifter said. He didn't shout. His voice simply carried, cutting through the heat like a razor blade. Bo Miller froze his grip, loosening slightly on Cora's hair. Jackson Ford shifted his weight against the rain barrel, his hand inching toward the burlap sack. Levi Stanton took half a step backward. Cole Wallace let out a barking laugh, though his eyes narrowed dangerously. He sized up the stranger. Worn coat, dusty boots, one gun. Well, boys, Cole drawled. Looks like we got ourselves a knight in shining armor. You lost, friend. You must be, because nobody in their right mind interrupts my business in Owyhee Creek. Her business is finished, the drifter replied smoothly. Walk away. Leave town. Don't come back. The sheer audacity of the demand stunned the 4 men for a fraction of a second. Then rage flushed Cole's scarred face dark red. Do you have any idea who you're talking to, you dirt farming tramp? Cole roared, his hand dropping to rest squarely on his gun butt. "I'm Cole Wallace. I'll shoot your eyes out and feed them to the coyotes." "I don't care if you're the president of the republic," the drifter said softly. It happened in a heartbeat. Jackson Ford, trying to be clever, swept the burlap sack off the rain barrel, revealing the sawed-off double-barrel shotgun. He swung it toward the stranger. The drifter had already moved. He didn't draw from a standing position. He dropped low, his knee slamming into the dirt, making himself a fraction of the target he was a second prior. His hand was a blur. The Colt cleared leather, cocked, and fired in one fluid, continuous motion. Bang! The heavy .45 caliber slug caught Jackson Ford dead in the throat before his finger could even find the shotgun's triggers. Ford gurgled, dropping the heavy weapon as he collapsed over the rain barrel, blood spraying across the dry wood. Bo Miller shoved Cora aside, screaming a curse, and drew his Remington. The drifter fanned the hammer of his Colt. Bang! The second shot punched through Miller's right shoulder, spinning him violently. The Remington fired a wild shot into the saloon's second-story window, shattering glass. Miller hit the boardwalk hard, screaming in agony. Cole Wallace, an experienced killer, had drawn his weapon the moment Ford went for the shotgun. He leveled his heavy six-shooter, aiming at the kneeling drifter. But the sun was exactly where the drifter knew it would be. As Cole tried to align his sights, the blinding Arizona glare hit his retinas. He squinted his shot, pulling slightly to the left. The bullet tore through the canvas of the drifter's duster, grazing his ribs, burning like a hot iron. The drifter didn't flinch. He thumbed the hammer back a third time, shifting his aim. Bang! Cole Wallace's chest erupted. The force of the impact knocked the massive man backward. He stumbled, his gun falling from his numb fingers, and crashed through the swinging doors of the saloon landing, dead on the sawdust-covered floor inside. Suddenly, the street was deafeningly silent, save for the moans of Bo Miller bleeding out on the wooden planks. The drifter slowly rose from his kneeling position. Smoke curled lazily from the barrel of his Colt. He didn't reholster. He looked around. 3 men down. He had counted 4. A scuffling sound echoed from the narrow alleyway beside the Mercantile. Levi Stanton. The rat had run the moment the shooting started. The drifter casually broke open his Colt, ejecting the 3 spent brass casings. They hit the dirt with sharp musical clinks. He slid 3 fresh cartridges from his belt, loaded them, and snapped the cylinder shut. He turned to look at Cora. The girl was huddled against a horse trough, trembling violently, her eyes wide with shock and terror as she stared at the carnage. "Go to your mother," the drifter told her gently. Without a word, Cora scrambled to her feet and ran as fast as her legs could carry her, disappearing down a side street. The drifter turned his attention to the alley. Levi Stanton was not a brave man, but a cornered rat was dangerous. The drifter knew Stanton wouldn't just keep running. The desert outside of town was a death sentence without water or a horse. He was hiding, waiting for an ambush. Blood seeped through the hole in the drifter's duster, warm and sticky against his side. He ignored the pain. Pain was an old friend. He began walking toward the alleyway, his steps completely silent now, the heavy spurs muffled by the dirt. He reached the corner of the Mercantile. The alley was cast in deep shadow, cluttered with discarded crates, broken wagon wheels, and refuse. The stench of rotting garbage was overpowering. The drifter paused, pressing his back against the rough, sun-baked wood of the building. He listened. Beneath the buzzing of horseflies, he heard it. The ragged, panicked breathing of a terrified man. It was coming from behind a stack of empty whiskey barrels about 20 feet down the narrow passage. "Levi," the drifter called out, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Your friends are dead or dying. You don't have to join them." "Go to hell!" Stanton's voice shrieked back, high-pitched and breaking. A shot rang out from behind the barrels. The bullet splintered the corner of the building, showering the drifter's face with wood fragments. The drifter didn't return fire. He waited. He knew Stanton was armed with a 6-shooter. That left 5 rounds. "There's nowhere to run, Levi," the drifter said, picking up a fist-sized rock from the ground. "Throw your gun out. I'll let the territorial marshal sort you out." "You're lying!" Stanton screamed, firing 2 more shots in rapid succession. One embedded itself in a discarded crate. The other whined harmlessly past the drifter into the street. 3 rounds left. The drifter tossed the rock over the whiskey barrels. It clattered loudly against the back wall of the alley. Stanton panicked, reacting to the sound behind him. He spun around and fired twice at the shadows, one round left. The drifter stepped out from the corner, his Colt raised and steady. Stanton realized his mistake, spinning back to face the opening of the alley. He raised his gun, his hands shaking violently and his eyes wild with fear. "Don't," the drifter commanded softly. Stanton pulled the trigger. A loud click echoed through the alley. In his panic, he had miscounted his shots. Stanton stared at his empty weapon in horror, then looked up at the cold, impassive face of the man standing before him. He dropped the gun and fell to his knees, throwing his hands in the air. "Please," Stanton begged, tears streaming down his dirt-streaked face. "Please, mister, I ain't done nothing. I just rode with him. I didn't hurt that girl. Please." The drifter lowered his Colt slightly. He stared at the weeping man for a long, quiet moment. The town of Owyhee Creek remained dead silent, holding its breath. "You stood by," the drifter said, his voice devoid of mercy. "A man who stands by while wolves attack a lamb is a wolf himself." He raised the Colt. Bang! Stanton pitched backward, a small dark hole squarely between his eyes. The drifter stood in the alley for a moment, the smell of cordite heavy in the air. He turned and walked back out into the bright afternoon sun. He holstered his weapon. Thaddeus Montgomery was standing on his porch, gripping the railing with white knuckles. He was staring at the bodies littering his town. He looked at the $20 gold piece still resting on the floorboards, then up at the nameless man. "I reckon," Thaddeus swallowed hard, his voice trembling, "I reckon I'd better start cutting that pine." "Make it sturdy," the drifter replied, walking slowly back toward his roan horse. "There's more of them at the ranch, and they'll be coming." Blood stained the splintered floorboards of the physician's office, dripping a steady, morbid rhythm from the edge of the operating table. Dr. Harrison Reed, a man whose medical license was as faded as his eyesight, hands, shaking with a mix of cheap bourbon and raw terror, wiped a bloody rag across his forehead. He had spent the last 10 years pulling decayed teeth and setting the occasional broken leg from a horse kick. He had never dug lead out of a man who looked at him with eyes as dead and cold as a frozen river. "You're lucky, mister," Dr. Reed mumbled, his breath reeking of rye whiskey as he tossed a deformed, bloody piece of lead into a tin basin. The clink echoed loudly in the quiet room. It rode the rib, deflected out. An inch to the left and it would have punctured your lung. You'd be drowning in your own blood right now. The nameless drifter sat shirtless on the edge of the examination table. His torso was a map of old violence, burn scars, jagged knife wounds, and the puckered indentations of past bullet holes. He didn't flinch as the doctor poured raw iodine over the fresh weeping groove in his side. He merely clenched his jaw, his muscles knotting like twisted steel cables. "Stitch it," the drifter commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. As Reed fumbled with his needle and catgut, the drifter picked up his canvas duster from the chair. He reached into the deep inside pocket and pulled out a crumpled, blood-spattered envelope. He had taken it off Cole Wallace's body before Thaddeus Montgomery hauled the corpse away. The wax seal was broken. He unfolded the heavy parchment. It wasn't a letter from a sweetheart or a gambling debt. It was a legal writ bearing the official seal of the Arizona Territorial Court. The drifter's eyes narrowed as he read the fine, cursive script. It was signed by Judge Horatio L. Cunningham, a powerful magistrate known throughout the Southwest for his supposedly uncompromising gavels and sudden unexplained wealth. The document was a foreclosure order granting the entire township of Owyhee Creek the land, the mineral rights, and the natural springs to the Wallace Cattle Company, citing unpaid municipal taxes that didn't actually exist. The gang hadn't just been bullying the town for sport. They were systematically terrorizing the populace into abandoning their claims, so Jasper Wallace Cole's older brother and the patriarch of the empire could absorb the territory legally. "They're taking the town," the drifter muttered, folding the paper and tucking it into his belt. Dr. Reed tied off the last suture and snipped the gut. "Jasper Wallace takes whatever he wants, mister, and when he finds out you put his baby brother Cole in a pine box, God help us all. Jasper employs former border ruffians, men who rode with Quantrill. He's got 50 riders out at the Cross W Ranch, heavily armed and meaner than rattlesnakes. Or then 50 riders are going to need graves," the drifter said, sliding his arms back into his shirt and carefully putting on his ruined duster. He tossed a silver dollar onto the metal tray. "Much obliged, Doc," 20 miles outside of town, the Cross W Ranch sprawling across the arid valley was a fortress of timber and barbed wire. In the main house, Jasper Wallace sat behind a massive mahogany desk shipped all the way from St. Louis. Jasper was a lean greyhound of a man with cold, calculating eyes and a neatly trimmed silver mustache. He wore a tailored suit looking more like an Eastern banker than a cattle baron, which made him infinitely more dangerous than his brutish brother. The heavy oak doors of the study burst open. A dusty, exhausted rider practically fell into the room. It was one of the Wallace outriders who had been in Owyhee Creek buying supplies. "Mr. Wallace," the rider gasped, ripping his hat off. "It's Cole, sir, and Bo, and Jackson. Levi, too." Jasper didn't look up from his ledger. "Speak plainly, son. What kind of trouble did my idiot brother get into this time? Did he burn down the saloon again?" "He's dead, Mr. Wallace," the rider blurted out. "They're all dead, shot down in the middle of the street." Jasper's pen snapped in his fingers. Ink spilled across the ledger, pooling like dark blood. He slowly stood up, his face an impassive mask, but the sheer malevolence radiating from him made the rider take a terrified step back. "Who?" Jasper asked softly. "A stranger? A drifter? One man, sir? He walked up, and before anyone could blink, he put them all down. Thaddeus is building the coffins now." Jasper walked over to the fireplace, staring into the cold ashes. Coal was a liability, a blunt instrument, but he was blood. And more importantly, the Wallace name had just been humiliated in front of the very town Jasper was trying to steal. If a single nameless vagabond could butcher his enforcers, the townspeople might find their spine. The legal theft engineered by Judge Cunningham would fall apart if the town fought back. "Saddle the men!" Jasper ordered, his voice echoing with lethal intent. "Every last one of them. Hand out the Winchester repeaters and the extra ammunition from the armory. We ride for Owyhee Creek at sundown." He turned to the rider, his eyes burning with a terrifying, icy rage. "We don't just kill this stranger. We make an example of him. We string him up from the saloon rafters, and then we burn the town to the absolute ground. I want the earth salted so nothing ever grows there again." Shadows lengthened across the dusty main street of Owyhee Creek, turning the town into a canyon of encroaching darkness. The oppressive heat of the day gave way to a chilling, expectant wind. The town was a graveyard of the living. Doors were heavily barred, windows shuttered tight, and families huddled in their cellars, clutching rosaries and hunting rifles with equal desperation. The drifter stood alone in the center of the thoroughfare, loading a heavy 10-gauge double-barrel stagecoach gun he had requisitioned from the terrified proprietor of the mercantile. He cracked the breech, slid 2 massive brass shells into the chambers, and snapped it shut with a satisfying metallic clack. He had chosen the local saloon, the Painted Lady, as his Alamo. It was built of thick, sturdy oak logs, featured a second-story balcony that offered a commanding view of the main approach, and had only 2 entry points, the front swinging doors and a reinforced back exit leading to the alley. Thaddeus Montgomery, wiping sweat and sawdust from his brow, walked up beside him. The undertaker carried a rusty Spencer repeating rifle. "4 boxes are built and waiting," Thaddeus said grimly, "though I reckon I should have started on mine. You really think you can hold them off from the saloon?" "I don't intend to just hold them off," the drifter replied, pulling a thick coil of fuse wire and 3 sticks of mining dynamite from his saddlebags. "I intend to break them." He walked toward the edge of town, where the main road narrowed between 2 high rocky embankments, the only logical path for a mass of riders coming from the Cross W Ranch. Thaddeus watched in horrified fascination as the drifter buried the dynamite charges beneath the soft dirt of the road, carefully running the long fuse wire back toward the livery stable. "You're turning the town into a slaughterhouse," a slick, nervous voice called out. Bartholomew Finch, the owner of the Painted Lady, stepped out onto the boardwalk. He was a corpulent man, sweating profusely through his expensive silk vest. Finch had made a comfortable living appeasing the Wallace gang, offering them free whiskey and turning a blind eye to their brutality in exchange for his own safety. "I'm keeping it from becoming a graveyard," the drifter said, not looking up as he packed dirt over the explosive charge. "You're a fool." Finch spat his eyes, darting nervously toward the horizon. "Jasper Wallace will kill us all because of your pride. I've sent word to him, I sent my stable boy out an hour ago to intercept his riders." The drifter stopped. He slowly stood up, turning to face the saloon owner. The silence that fell over the street was heavier than a hangman's knot. Thaddeus tightened his grip on his rifle. "You did what?" the drifter asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I told them where you'll be," Finch declared, though his voice wavered under the drifter's cold stare. "I told them you're setting up in my saloon. I told them if they spare my establishment, I'll make sure the back door is unlocked for them. I'm a businessman, mister. I survive. You're just a dead man walking." The drifter didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply drew his Colt in a motion so fast it defied the eye. Finch shrieked, throwing his hands up over his face, expecting a bullet. Instead, the drifter stepped forward and violently brought the heavy steel barrel of the Colt crashing down across Finch's jaw. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the empty street. Finch collapsed into the dust like a sacked pig, spitting blood and teeth groaning in agony. "Business is closed," the drifter stated, holstering his weapon. He looked at Thaddeus. "Drag him into the jailhouse and lock the iron door. If he makes a sound, shoot him." Thaddeus nodded eagerly, grabbing the moaning saloon owner by the collar of his silk vest and dragging him away. The betrayal changed the geometry of the battle. Wallace's men wouldn't blindly charge the front. They knew where he was, and they knew his defenses. They would come from the alleys. They would surround the building. The drifter walked back into the saloon. He began kicking over the heavy mahogany tables barricading the front doors and the lower floor windows. He hauled sacks of flour and grain from the kitchen, stacking them against the walls to absorb bullet impacts. He placed the loaded stagecoach gun behind the makeshift counter barricade, along with 3 extra 6-shooters and a Winchester rifle. Then he climbed the narrow wooden stairs to the second floor. He stepped out onto the balcony, blending into the deep shadows of the awning. He checked the cylinder of his Colt. 6 rounds. He checked the Winchester. 15 rounds. He looked down at the empty, silent street of Owyhee Creek. The wind howled through the gaps in the wooden buildings, sounding like a chorus of weeping ghosts. Off in the distance, over the crest of the eastern ridge, a dull orange glow began to manifest against the darkening sky. It was the collective light of dozens of torches. A low rumble vibrated through the floorboards beneath the drifter's boots. It sounded like thunder, but the sky was clear. It was the sound of 50 horses riding hard, driving a wave of death toward the town. The storm had arrived. They didn't ride in howling like Apaches. Jasper Wallace was a tactician. The thunder of hooves slowed to a terrifying synchronized trot as the mass of riders breached the edge of town. Through the darkness, the drifter could see the silhouettes of men fanning out, dismounting and taking cover behind the mercantile, the livery stable, and the abandoned blacksmith forge. From his vantage point on the saloon balcony, the drifter remained perfectly still, a phantom in the shadows. He had an unlit cigar clamped between his teeth. "Stranger," a voice boomed from the darkness near the livery. It was Jasper Wallace. His voice carried a refined, aristocratic edge that contrasted sharply with the barbaric intent behind it. "I know you're in there. Bartholomew Finch was very accommodating before you assaulted him. You have 2 choices. Walk out that front door with your hands raised and I'll grant you a quick hanging. Stay inside and my men will turn that building into splinters and burn you alive." The drifter struck a lucifer match against his boot heel. The sudden flare of light in the darkness was a beacon. He lit his cigar, the cherry glowing bright red, and casually tossed the burning match over the balcony rail. It wasn't just a gesture of defiance. The match fluttered down, landing perfectly on the long, oil-soaked fuse wire he had run from the buried dynamite all the way to the saloon's porch. The fuse sparked, hissed, and began racing rapidly back toward the narrow embankment at the edge of town, right where Jasper had left 20 of his men guarding the horses. "What is that?" one of the Wallace riders yelled, pointing at the sparking trail of fire weaving through the dirt. "Cut it!" Jasper screamed, suddenly realizing the trap. It was too late. The spark vanished beneath the dirt road. For a fraction of a second, the world held its breath. Then, the earth ruptured. The explosion was deafening. A massive geyser of dirt, rock, and fire erupted into the night sky, illuminating the town in a harsh, demonic glare. The shockwave shattered every remaining window on the street. Screams of men and the panicked shrieking of horses filled the air as the blast decimated the rear guard of the Wallace gang. Fire. Jasper roared, his sophisticated facade shattering into pure murderous rage. The street erupted into a chaotic blizzard of lead. Dozens of rifles and revolvers opened up simultaneously, unleashing a merciless barrage against the saloon. Bullets chewed through the wooden facade, splintering the pillars and shattering the painted lady sign. The deafening roar of gunfire was continuous, like the tearing of massive sheets of canvas. The drifter dropped flat onto the balcony floorboards as a volley of Winchester rounds shredded the railing above his head. He crawled to the edge, rested the barrel of his own Winchester through a gap in the balusters, and found his first target, a rider exposing himself from behind the water trough to fire. The drifter exhaled, squeezed the trigger and worked the lever action. Crack, crack, crack. 3 shots fired in 3 seconds. The rider behind the trough jerked violently backward, his rifle flying from his hands, and collapsed dead into the muddy water. Another man tried to sprint across the open street toward the alleyway. The drifter tracked him, fired once, and dropped him mid-stride with a bullet through the spine. But there were too many. The sheer volume of incoming fire was tearing the saloon apart. Downstairs, the drifter could hear bullets thudding heavily into his flour sack barricades. Then, over the cacophony of small arms, a new sound emerged. A mechanical, heavy, rhythmic grinding. Clack, 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 clack. The drifter's blood ran cold. He knew that sound. He had heard it on the blood-soaked fields of Antietam. God in heaven, Thaddeus Montgomery whispered from his hiding spot in the jailhouse across the street, peering through the iron bars. From the center of the Wallace line, 2 heavy draft horses pulled a wooden carriage into the main street. Mounted on top was a brass behemoth with 6 rotating barrels, a model 1874 Gatling gun. Jasper had called in every favor and bribe he had with the corrupt quartermaster stationed at Fort Whipple to acquire it. A heavy-set gunner cranked the handle. The Gatling gun roared to life, spitting a continuous, devastating stream of .45-70 government rounds. The heavy-caliber bullets didn't just pierce the saloon, they obliterated it. The thick oak logs splintered and exploded under the sheer kinetic force. The front doors disintegrated. The balcony beneath the drifter began to give way, structural beams groaning and snapping like dry twigs. "Tear it down!" Jasper yelled over the mechanical roar, a manic smile twisting his face beneath the gun smoke. The drifter scrambled back toward the balcony door as the floorboards disintegrated beneath him. A heavy Gatling round punched through the wood, grazing his leather boot and sending a spray of sharp splinters into his calf. He dove through the doorway, tumbling into the second-floor hallway, just as the entire front half of the balcony sheared off and crashed into the street below in a cloud of dust and debris. He was pinned down. The Gatling gun was systematically sweeping the building, ripping through the walls as easily as paper. Plaster rained down on him. The air was thick with choking white dust and the acrid smell of burnt powder. They were going to shred the building and him along with it. The drifter crawled down the hallway toward the back stairs. His only advantage was the darkness inside the saloon and the layout he had memorized. He descended the stairs, keeping his head low, sliding behind the overturned bar counter where he had left his stagecoach gun. "They're reloading the big gun," a voice yelled from outside. "Move up, burn it! Burn the place down!" Through the shattered remnants of the front wall, the drifter saw 4 men sprinting toward the saloon, carrying blazing torches made of pitch-soaked rags. They intended to toss them inside and incinerate whatever was left standing. The drifter dropped his Winchester and grabbed the heavy 10-gauge stagecoach gun. He waited until the 4 men reached the boardwalk, their faces illuminated by the sinister orange glow of their torches. He popped up from behind the bar. He didn't aim. With a scattergun at 10 yards, he didn't need to. He pulled both triggers simultaneously. The double blast in the enclosed space was catastrophic. A wall of buckshot cleared the ruined doorway, striking 3 of the torchbearers instantly. The men were thrown backward into the dirt, their torches tumbling from their lifeless hands. One of the torches landed directly on the dry wooden planks of the boardwalk, the pitch instantly igniting the sun-baked wood. The 4th man, untouched but terrified, turned to flee. The drifter drew his Colt, fired a single shot, and put a bullet cleanly through the back of the man's knee. He went down screaming. The flames from the dropped torch quickly spread to the side of the saloon, climbing the dry timber like a hungry animal. The inside of the building began to fill with thick black smoke. "He's still alive in there," someone shouted from the street. The mechanical grinding of the Gatling gun started again. The heavy rounds tore through the bar counter, exploding the flour sacks the drifter had stacked, blanketing him in a cloud of white powder mixed with wood shrapnel. The drifter was out of options for a frontal assault. The building was burning, the air was unbreathable, and a military-grade weapon had him pinned. He coughed, pulling his bandana up over his nose and mouth. He grabbed his remaining weapons, crawling toward the reinforced back door. Finch had promised the gang this door would be unlocked. The drifter had left it unlocked, but he had also wedged a heavy iron crowbar tightly under the exterior handle, effectively jamming it from the outside, and scattered an entire box of sharp, rusty farrier's nails across the muddy alleyway floor. He kicked the back door open and stepped out into the pitch-black alley, immediately pressing his back against the brick wall of the adjacent bank. He wasn't running. He was changing the battlefield. He could hear the heavy boots of Wallace's men crunching through the dirt as they circled around the burning saloon, attempting to flank him. They thought they were trapping a rat in a burning maze. They didn't realize they had just stepped into the dark with a ghost. Smoke poured from the splintered roof of the Painted Lady, painting the starry Arizona sky in violent strokes of charcoal and ember. Inside the cramped, garbage-strewn alley behind the adjacent territorial bank, the heat was already becoming unbearable. The nameless drifter pressed his shoulders against the cool brick of the bank's rear wall, letting the impenetrable darkness swallow him whole. He breathed slowly in through his nose and out through his mouth, ignoring the agonizing sting of the bullet graze on his ribs and the wooden shrapnel embedded in his calf. In the chaotic din of the Gatling gun tearing apart the saloon's facade, the subtle sounds of the alley were almost masked. Almost. 5 men dispatched by Jasper Wallace to cut off any retreat crept around the burning building. They were seasoned killers, men who had ridden with the notorious John Wesley Hardin down in Texas before seeking better pay with the Cross W Ranch. But they were arrogant. They expected a terrified, fleeing target coughing up smoke. Caleb, a heavy-set tracker from Sonora, led the flanking maneuver, a Smith & Wesson Model 3 Schofield revolver clutched tightly in his sweating hand. Behind him walked Amos, a stringy rustler with a missing eye, followed by 3 others. "Keep your eyes peeled," Caleb hissed over his shoulder. "Boss wants him alive if possible, but dead works just fine." Amos took another step into the pitch-black alley. His leather boot came down hard into the mud. A rusty 3-inch farrier's nail, deliberately scattered by the drifter, moments before punched straight through the sole of Amos's boot, driving deep into the soft arch of his foot. Amos let out a blood-curdling shriek, dropping his rifle to clutch at his leg. "Sweet Jesus, I'm spiked, my foot!" The sudden scream shattered the hunter's discipline. Caleb spun around, aiming his Schofield blindly into the dark. "Shut up, Amos! You're giving away our position!" They were already dead. They just didn't know it yet. From the shadows mere inches behind the rearmost man, the drifter materialized. He didn't use a firearm. The muzzle flash would give away his exact location. Instead, his right hand gripped a heavy bone-handled Bowie knife, a relic from the bloody battlefields of Shiloh. With a brutal, silent efficiency, the drifter wrapped his left forearm around the man's throat, yanking him backward while the heavy steel blade drove upward under the rib cage, piercing the heart. The man let out a wet gasp, his legs giving out instantly. The drifter lowered the corpse silently to the muddy ground. "Who's there?" Caleb shouted, his voice cracking with sudden unfamiliar panic. "Ezekiel, answer me!" No answer came. Only the crackling of the burning saloon and the distant rhythmic grinding of the Gatling gun. "Light a match!" Amos groaned from the ground, trying frantically to pry his boot off the rusted nail. "I can't see a damn thing." One of the remaining thugs fumbled in his vest pocket, striking a sulfur match against the brick wall. The tiny flame flared to life, casting dancing demonic shadows across the alleyway. The brief illumination revealed the drifter, standing completely still less than 10 feet away. His face, a terrifying mask of soot, dried blood, and cold intent. In his right hand, the heavy Colt single-action army was already leveled. Bang! The man holding the match took a .45 caliber slug squarely in the chest. The match fell to the mud, instantly extinguishing, plunging the alley back into pitch darkness. Complete panic overtook the survivors. Caleb and the remaining thug opened fire blindly into the dark, the muzzle flashes strobing like lightning, briefly illuminating the trash and discarded barrels. Bullets chipped the brickwork and tore through the wooden crates, but they hit nothing but air. The drifter had already moved the second he pulled the trigger, dropping low and rolling silently behind a stack of rotting whiskey barrels. Amos, still pinned to the ground by the nail in his foot, screamed in terror as his own men fired wildly over his head. "Cease fire! You're gonna hit me!" The gunfire stopped, leaving Caleb and his one remaining partner breathing heavily in the dark, their ears ringing from the concussive blasts in the narrow space. "I think we got him," Caleb whispered, his hands trembling as he thumbed the hammer back on his Schofield. A sharp metallic clack echoed from the darkness directly above them. Caleb looked up just as the drifter leaped from the top of the whiskey barrels. The nameless gunman landed heavily on the thug next to Caleb, driving his boot viciously into the man's neck, snapping it with a sickening crunch. Caleb swung his revolver around, but the drifter was faster. He slapped the barrel of the Schofield aside with his left hand, while his right hand brought the heavy steel frame of his Colt crashing down against Caleb's temple. Caleb collapsed unconscious before he even hit the mud. Only Amos remained sobbing in pain on the ground, frantically trying to crawl backward. The drifter walked over to him, his heavy spurs chiming a slow death knell. He loomed over the rustler, a terrifying silhouette against the ambient glow of the burning saloon. "Please," Amos begged, holding his hands up. "I just ride for the pay. I got a wife down in Tucson. Please." "The girl in the street had a mother," the drifter said softly. He didn't waste a bullet. He simply raised his heavy boot and brought it down hard on Amos's jaw, knocking him out cold. The alley was secure, but the front of the street was still a war zone. The Gatling gun had completely sheared away the front wall of the Painted Lady, and the fire was now threatening to spread to the adjacent bank. The drifter knelt beside the unconscious Caleb and stripped the man of his gun belt, taking the Schofield revolver and a handful of spare cartridges. He needed to get elevated. He needed an angle on that brass behemoth in the street. At the back of the Territorial Bank, a rickety wooden fire escape led up to the flat tar-papered roof. The drifter climbed quickly, ignoring the screaming pain in his calf, his boots making no sound on the old wood. Gaining the roof of the bank, the drifter crawled on his belly to the front parapet. The heat rising from the burning saloon next door was blistering, singing the hair on his arms and threatening to ignite his duster. Thick black smoke rolled over the roof edge, choking him, but it also provided perfect concealment. He peered over the brick ledge. The main street of Owyhee Creek looked like a vision of hell. The saloon was fully engulfed in flames, roaring like a blast furnace. Dozens of Wallace's men crouched behind water troughs, wagons, and building corners, firing aimlessly into the inferno, convinced their target was burning alive inside. In the center of the street, 50 yards away, sat the horse-drawn Gatling gun carriage. Jasper Wallace stood safely behind the heavy wooden wheels of the carriage, his expensive suit now covered in ash and soot. He was yelling orders, his face contorted in a mask of ugly, desperate rage. Operating the heavy crank of the Gatling gun was a massive bald man named Hiram, a notorious former Pinkerton enforcer who had been fired for excessive brutality during the railroad strikes in Pennsylvania. Hiram was laughing a sickening sound over the roar of the fire as he cranked the handle, sending a continuous stream of hot lead into the burning wreckage. Two other men stood on the carriage beside him, furiously feeding long strips of brass cartridges into the weapon's top-mounted hopper. The Gatling gun was a slaughtering machine capable of firing 400 rounds a minute. As long as it was operational, moving into the street meant being cut to ribbons. The drifter slid his Winchester rifle over the brick ledge. He rested the hot barrel on the parapet, pressing the wooden stock firmly against his shoulder. He closed his left eye, looking down the iron sights. 50 yards was a difficult shot at night, surrounded by thick smoke, erratic firelight, and the shifting shadows of chaos. But the drifter did not calculate based on luck. He watched the rhythm of the men feeding the gun. He watched the way Hiram's massive body swayed with the crank. He breathed out, letting half the air escape his lungs, and held it. His finger tightened on the trigger. Crack. The Winchester roared. Down in the street, Hiram's head snapped violently backward. The heavy .44-40 slug caught the gunner squarely in the right eye, exiting through the back of his skull in a spray of dark crimson. Hiram's massive body slumped forward, collapsing heavily over the crank handle. The deafening roar of the Gatling gun ceased instantly. The sudden silence, save for the crackling of the fire, was a physical shock to the men in the street. Jasper Wallace froze, staring in stunned disbelief at his dead gunner. "Where did that come from?" he screamed, drawing his own pearl-handled revolver. "He's not in the saloon. Find him!" Before the two ammunition feeders on the carriage could pull Hiram's body off the crank, the drifter worked the lever of his Winchester and fired twice more in rapid succession. Crack, crack. The first feeder grabbed his throat, dropping the strip of ammunition, and tumbled backward off the carriage, hitting the dirt with a heavy thud. The second feeder panicked, dropping his rifle, and turned to run for the livery stable. The drifter tracked him, fired a third time, and put a bullet cleanly through the fleeing man's thigh, sending him crashing into the dust. On the bank roof, one of Jasper's men yelled, pointing a trembling finger up at the muzzle flashes cutting through the smoke. "He's on the roof!" A dozen rifles swung toward the bank. The brick parapet above the drifter exploded as a hail of bullets tore into it, sending sharp fragments of clay and mortar raining down on his back. He rolled away from the edge, pressing himself flat against the hot tar paper as lead chewed through the air inches above him. "Burn the bank down!" Jasper roared, completely losing his aristocratic composure. His empire, his authority, and his brother were being dismantled by one nameless phantom. "I want every building in this miserable town reduced to ashes. Burn it all." But the men were hesitating. The sight of the invincible Gatling gun silenced, and three of their strongest fighters, dropped in a matter of seconds, had fundamentally broken their morale. They were cowpunchers and hired thugs, not soldiers. They expected to bully dirt farmers, not fight a demon who shot from the shadows and never missed. "I ain't getting paid enough to fight a ghost," a young rider muttered, backing away from the light of the fire into the shadows. He holstered his gun, turned, and bolted for his horse. "Stand your ground, you cowards!" Jasper screamed, firing his pearl-handled revolver wildly into the air. "I'll shoot the next man who runs." The drifter knew this was the turning point. A wounded animal was the most dangerous, and Jasper Wallace was backed into a corner of his own making. He quickly reloaded his Winchester, sliding fresh cartridges through the side loading gate. He crawled to the rear of the bank roof. The fire escape was too exposed now. He looked down at the dark alley. It was a 15-foot drop to the muddy ground. He didn't hesitate. He swung his legs over the back ledge and dropped. He landed hard, bending his knees to absorb the impact, but his wounded calf gave out. A bolt of white-hot agony shot up his leg, forcing him to one knee. He gritted his teeth, tasting copper, and forced himself back up. He had to end this now before Jasper made good on his threat to burn the rest of Owyhee Creek. He limped out of the alley, emerging onto the boardwalk several buildings down from the burning saloon, cloaked in the heavy shadows of the mercantile awning. The street was a scene of apocalyptic disarray. The painted lady was nothing but a collapsing skeletal frame of burning timber. A thick pall of smoke hung over the town, stinging the eyes and choking the lungs. Several of Jasper's men had already fled into the night, but about 15 hardened killers remained huddled behind whatever cover they could find, rifles trained on the bank roof. Jasper Wallace stood near the town's small brick jailhouse, breathing heavily, his eyes darting around wildly. He realized the fire from the roof had stopped. "He's moving!" Jasper yelled. "Watch the alleys!" Suddenly, the heavy iron door of the jailhouse groaned open. Jasper whipped around. Thaddeus Montgomery, the undertaker, stood in the doorway, his rusty Spencer rifle trembling in his hands. Thaddeus had watched the entire slaughter from the barred window, and something inside the old man had finally snapped. "Get out of our town, Wallace," Thaddeus croaked, raising the rifle toward the cattle baron. It was a brave, foolish act. Jasper didn't even flinch. He sneered, his cold eyes narrowing. "You miserable old fool." Before Thaddeus could pull the heavy trigger, Jasper lashed out, slapping the barrel of the Spencer aside. With lightning speed, he grabbed Thaddeus by the collar of his shirt, spun him around, and pressed the barrel of his pearl-handled revolver hard against the undertaker's temple. Jasper dragged the struggling old man out into the center of the muddy, blood-stained street, using him as a human shield. "I know you're down here, stranger." Jasper's voice echoed through the town, cutting through the crackle of the flames. I know you can hear me. You want to be a savior. Here's a citizen of Owyhee Creek. Step out into the light, drop your weapons, or I blow this old man's brains into the mud right now." The remaining Wallace men murmured slowly, standing up from their cover, their guns raised, scanning the shadows. Thaddeus squeezed his eyes shut, trembling violently. "Don't do it, mister," he yelled. "Let him shoot me. Just kill the bastard." "Shut up," Jasper snarled, pressing the gun harder against Thaddeus's skull. 10 seconds, stranger, or the Undertaker needs his own box." From the deep shadows beneath the mercantile awning, the drifter stepped out into the flickering orange light of the burning town. He didn't walk with a limp. He forced his shattered leg to hold firm, moving with a slow, terrifying grace. In his right hand, the heavy Colt rested loosely by his side. His duster was scorched, his face covered in blood and ash, but his eyes burned with a cold, relentless fury that made even the hardest killers in the street take a nervous step back. "Let him go, Jasper," the drifter said. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, resonant rumble like distant thunder promising a flood. "Drop the gun!" Jasper screamed, his composure completely shattered by the sight of the man who had decimated his army. "Kick it away, or I swear to God I'll kill him." The drifter stopped 30 feet away. The distance was exactly the same as it had been with Cole Wallace hours earlier. He looked at the pearl-handled revolver pressed against Thaddeus's head. Jasper had the hammer cocked, a hair trigger, a fractional flinch, and the old man was dead. "You think you represent the law here because you bought a judge like Horatio Cunningham?" The drifter asked, his voice echoing off the silent storefronts. He slowly, deliberately raised his left hand, holding the blood-stained foreclosure document he had taken from Cole. Jasper's eyes widened in shock at the sight of the parchment. "That piece of paper means nothing." The drifter continued, tossing the document into the mud. "Your brother is dead. Half your men are dead. You don't own this town, Wallace. You just bought a plot in its graveyard." "Shoot him," Jasper screamed at his men. But the remaining thugs didn't move. They were paralyzed. They looked at the drifter standing calmly in the open, and they looked at the Gatling gun rendered useless, surrounded by dead men. They had seen the devil at work tonight, and they wanted no part of his final act. "I said shoot him," Jasper roared, his finger tightening dangerously on his trigger. "They aren't going to die for you, Jasper," the drifter said softly. "It's just you and me. Then I'll kill him myself, and then I'll kill you." Jasper spat his knuckles, turning white. Gunfights at this distance involving a hostage were a matter of impossible mathematics. The drifter had to draw cock aim and fire before Jasper's brain could send the signal to his trigger finger to flinch. It was a fraction of a second, a window of time so small it bordered on the supernatural. The drifter didn't reach for his gun. He simply stared into Jasper's eyes. "You're afraid," the drifter stated flatly. The psychological strike hit its mark. Jasper's face twitched, his eyes instinctively darting toward the drifter's right hand for a microsecond. That microsecond was all the drifter needed. His hand was a blur of motion, faster than thought, faster than a striking rattlesnake. The Colt cleared leather. The hammer thumbed back. Bang! The gunshot was deafening in the tense silence. Thaddeus screamed, dropping to his knees, expecting to feel a bullet tear through his skull. He felt nothing but a spray of warm liquid across his cheek. Jasper Wallace stood completely still for a second. His pearl-handled revolver slipped from his lifeless fingers, clattering harmlessly into the dirt. A perfectly centered hole the size of a dime had appeared squarely in the middle of his forehead. His eyes rolled back, and the wealthy, ruthless cattle baron collapsed backward into the mud, dead, before his body hit the ground. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the whimpering of Thaddeus Montgomery and the shifting of the burning timbers. The drifter stood motionless, smoke curling lazily from the barrel of his Colt. He didn't look at the dead man. He shifted his cold gaze to the 15 heavily armed thugs still standing in the street. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. One by one, the men slowly lowered their weapons. A rider near the livery stable threw his Winchester into the dirt. Another unbuckled his gun belt, letting it drop heavily to the boardwalk. Within moments, the remnants of the dreaded Cross W gang were mounting their horses in terrified silence, turning their mounts around and riding out of Owyhee Creek as fast as they could never to return. The drifter slowly walked over to the Gatling gun carriage. He holstered his Colt and picked up a heavy blacksmith's hammer resting near the wheels. With 3 brutal swinging blows, he smashed the firing mechanism, rendering the horrific weapon permanently useless. He turned back to the street. Doors were cautiously creaking open, shutters were unlatched. The townspeople of Owyhee Creek, men and women who had cowered in fear for years, slowly stepped out onto the boardwalks. They stared in awe at the burning saloon, at the bodies littering the street, and at the nameless, blood-soaked man standing in the center of it all. Thaddeus Montgomery shakily got to his feet, wiping Jasper's blood from his face. He looked at the drifter, his eyes filled with a mixture of terror and profound gratitude. "Mr. Thaddeus choked out, his voice raw. I don't even know your name. How do we thank you?" The drifter didn't answer. He turned and limped toward the livery stable. His roan horse was waiting unfazed by the noise and the smoke. The drifter pulled himself into the saddle, grimacing as his wounded calf stretched against the stirrup. "You don't thank me," the drifter said, looking down at the undertaker from the shadow of his brim. "You bury the dead, you rebuild the saloon, and you make sure no one ever kicks a water bucket out of a child's hands in this town again." He spurred his horse, turning it toward the dark, open desert. "Wait!" Thaddeus called out, running a few steps after him. "What about the coffins? I built 4 boxes just like you asked." The drifter paused, looking back over his shoulder at the carnage he had wrought. Dead men lay in the mud on the carriage and in the alleys. "You're going to need more wood," the lone gunslinger said. With a slight flick of the reins, he rode out of Owyhee Creek, disappearing into the vast, unforgiving darkness of the Arizona Territory, leaving behind a town reborn in blood and ash, and a legend that would be whispered around campfires for 100 years. And there you have it, a brutal, unvarnished look at the real price of frontier justice. The nameless gunman didn't just take down 4 thugs, he dismantled an entire corrupt empire with nothing but a Colt of Winchester and a terrifyingly steady hand. When the law fails, it sometimes takes a monster to kill the wolves. History is filled with incredible bloody stories, just like this one buried under the desert sands. If you loved this wild ride through Owyhee Creek, do us a massive favor, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and hit subscribe so you never miss another gritty dive into the Wild West. Leave a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Thaddeus's shoes? Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.